Hello, I'm Mike Vinsel, and today is May 25th, 2024, and I'm continuing reading my book, Travels with Nobody. So right now we're going to begin chapter 10, which is on page 149, and that goes all the way up to page 170. And so here we go. Okay. Chapter 10, San Francisco. A sign said I was entering San Francisco. There was an exit for 3rd Street. I got off 101 to find a payphone. I went to a convenience store with a phone booth and called Matthew's number. "Hi, Matt. This is Stephen." "Stevie Mon!" Matthew exclaimed, using the nickname the Jamaicans at the apple orchard had called me. I had told him that before. He had been much amused by my stories of working with the Jamaicans. He asked me where I was. I looked for a street sign. I forget exactly where I was, but I told him I took the 3rd Street exit. Matthew told me to get back on 101 and take the exit for Golden Gate Park. Take a left onto Fell Street. He spelled it out. He said it was a one-way street. Take Fell to Masonic. Take a left onto Masonic, go past Oak, Page, and take a right onto Haight. Then, just 1 block later, take a left onto Ashbury. I followed his directions, and soon enough, there I was, taking a left onto Ashbury. This was the famous Haight-Ashbury. I remembered the famous picture of the Grateful Dead when they were young, posing for a photo hanging around the post for the sign for the Haight and Ashbury streets. There was no such signpost anymore. Instead, the street names were painted on the side of a building, on the corner, of course. How many times would a signpost like that be stolen? I drove up the hill past 710, the famous Grateful Dead house, and then I saw Matthew standing on the corner to meet me. I pulled up, and he got in. He explained how the parking situation worked. You could park where the curbs were unpainted. You just had to pay attention to the street cleaning hours on the signs. I parked right in front of his doorway, but I'd have to move the car later because they would have street cleaning in the morning. Easy enough. I had not known how they do things like that in a city. It was great to see Matthew. We went up to his apartment. It was on the 3rd floor. It had just 1 bedroom, but he had a couch with a fold-out bed. He said I could stay there. He had many paintings on his walls, mostly watercolors that he had done of landscapes, mountains, and fishing scenes. He also had several abstract paintings that he said he'd bought from one of his friends. The part of the apartment that would have been a dining room was occupied instead by a woodworking project resting on 2 sawhorses. He was making a pedal-powered catamaran. The pontoons were made of mahogany plywood, coated with fiberglass and epoxy. It looked very sleek and graceful. He said he was going to mount a modified bicycle frame to the setup so you could operate the boat as you would ride a bicycle, or a pedal-powered rocking horse, he said. It looked like a very interesting project. He said it was an engineering project for a class he was taking at San Francisco State University. Matthew showed me the kitchen, opened the fridge. "Oh," he looked around as if he'd just had an idea. "Oh yes, it's steam time," he exclaimed, purposefully mispronouncing the word steam. He brought out 2 bottles of Anchor steam beer. "If you're in San Francisco, you gotta have steam," he said, opening the bottles with a church key which hung on a string from a magnet on the refrigerator door. The kitchen window faced north and had a tremendous view of the city. Matthew pointed out the landmarks, the spires of St. Ignatius Church up by the University of San Francisco, lit up in the night. To the left, we could see the top of one of the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. It was a beautiful view. After we finished our beers, we went walking down to Haight Street. We passed 710 Ashbury. Now it was just a house with somebody living there, a nice Victorian house. There was no plaque or anything marking its history. Matthew and I wondered whether the past fame of the house had increased or reduced the property value. We agreed that it could go either way, depending on who the buyer would be. We got down onto Haight Street and took a left. Matthew pointed out all the places that were new and those that had been there in the 1960s. We laughed. Matthew had moved out to San Francisco when he was just Matthew had moved out to San Francisco when he was just a little older than me when I left. That was in the 1970s, when images of what the Haight-Ashbury had been in the 1960s still burned in the memory of our father. When Matthew had first brought up the idea of hitchhiking out to San Francisco, our father's reaction at the dinner table had been a contemptuous sneer. Well, don't go out to that damn Haight-Ashbury, he said. He'd barked. Our mother had changed the subject, pointing out the quality of the tomatoes in the salad. Burpee's early girl. She'd grown them herself. And where exactly did Matthew go? Bullseye, right into that damned Haight-Ashbury. We walked towards Stanton Street, the other side of which was Golden Gate Park. There was a Mexican restaurant called Chabella's that was popular with bicycle messengers. Matthew had done that job when he first arrived in the city. We went in and Matthew ordered chicken nachos. I had known nachos as being just a snack food, but these were a meal. The tortillas were real tortillas, not chips. On top of them was lettuce, tomatoes, a kind of stewed chicken in a sauce whose ingredients I could hardly guess, plus guacamole, sour cream, cheese, and salsa. I had never had food like that before. It was delicious. We went to a bar and had a few beers, and after that went back to the apartment. I was in San Francisco for the first time and loving it. Matthew had to work in the morning and would be gone all day. He suggested I spend the day checking out Golden Gate Park. He said that at night it can be dangerous. Sometimes people get mugged. In the daytime it's okay. Just watch myself, he told me. So that was my plan for the next day. I thought of that phrase, just watch yourself. What does that mean? It wouldn't be me I needed to watch. I'm not going to mug myself. What I would need to watch would be other people, to be on the lookout for suspicious behavior. I understood what he meant. It is just a figure of speech. But I remember when I was younger, I had had trouble understanding figures of speech. When I had gotten poor grades in school, which was every time I got a report card, Matthew had told me I had better get my shit together. He'd said that many times. As advice, I had found it too vague to act upon. I knew he hadn't meant it literally, get my shit together. I knew that what he'd meant was that I had to start getting good grades. I never said it aloud, but I knew back then that in order to get good grades, I would have to go back and be born a different person with a different brain. That was just something I remembered, a train of thought triggered by a figure of speech. Matthew got up in the morning and made coffee. He had made croissants and salmon spread from the store. He had bought croissants and salmon spread from the store just up the street. That made a fine breakfast. I had never had a real croissant before, nor salmon spread like that. It was very good. The coffee was good too. I was in the habit of always eating typical breakfast foods that you'd find at a diner: eggs, biscuits and gravy, fried potatoes, pancakes. This was different and very good, I thought. Matthew recommended that for exploring the park, I should buy a baguette of sourdough bread and a piece of real Parmesan cheese at the store where he got the croissants. He said that San Francisco sourdough bread was something I would have to experience. We ate our croissants and had coffee at the kitchen window. The window opened on a hinge from the side, like a door, but it was a window. I had never seen that before. The morning air was cool, not cold. Matthew pointed out the details of the view again, this time beautifully bathed in morning light. The twin spires of the St. Ignatius Church now looked ancient, like something out of a Renaissance painting. Low, wispy clouds drifted slowly across the city, lower than clouds had seemed in New Hampshire. We could even see the ships in San Francisco Bay in the distance. Matthew told me that I should also get a Muni map. They had them at newsstands down on Haight Street. Those had all the bus and subway routes. Anyway, so this is the picture, the view from Matthew's kitchen window there, and you can see that's my hand with a cup of coffee there, and there's St. Ignatius Church there, and this is the University of San Francisco. And anyway, that's what the view looked like. This would be somewhere down here would be Haight Street. It's kind of stylized, so it skips a few blocks. Anyway, that's the painting. Okay, Matthew left me with a key. He said he'd be back at around 6 o'clock. I stayed at the apartment for a little while. I must have taken a shower. Then I, too, headed out for the day. I went up to Frederick Street to the store to buy the bread and cheese. Then I went down to Haight Street and walked to Golden Gate Park. I bought a Muni map at a newsstand. The sun burned off any morning chill. It was perfect weather, not too hot, not too cold, and it was sunny. December in California. The map also had the main attractions of Golden Gate Park listed. I arrived at Stanton Street and crossed into the park. I followed the path through the park and came upon a large greenhouse with a beautiful lawn of flower beds in full bloom, even in December. This was the Conservatory of Flowers. I had always liked greenhouses. I decided to pay the entrance fee and go inside. It was like walking into paradise. There were all manner of tropical plants and trees, a banana tree with a 6-foot cluster of not yet ripe bananas arching down from the crown of its massive fronds. The whitewashed glass roof diffused the sunlight and made a bright but shadowless ambience. I watched a man standing atop a ladder trimming a coffee tree. A plaque labeled the tree as Coffea arabica. The branches were loaded with green and red berries. Okay, and this is a picture of the painting that I made of the Conservatory of Flowers in Golden Gate Park, and that character over here be Stephen Stroh, which I guess is sort of like me. Okay. In art classes in high school, I had learned the logic of the color wheel, that red and green are opposites. Green, being a mixture of blue and yellow, would fall opposite red on the wheel. I wondered how it was, then, that in sunrises and sunsets, yellow fades to blue, then to black, or the other way around, never to make green in the sky. Somehow the coffee berries on the branch were either red or green, but none were gray, which is what I would get if I mixed red paint with green. I liked thinking about that. The same thought had occurred to me about apples ripening. The man on the ladder noticed me looking at the coffee tree and came down to talk. He appeared to be Japanese. He asked if I had ever seen a living coffee tree. I had not. I told him it was very interesting to see. I told him that I had always been interested in greenhouses, that the heat of sunshine, that the heat of the sunshine can be captured. The heat of sunshine can be captured, allowing us to grow tropical plants in temperate climates. I noticed that in the soil at the foot of the tree there were some berries that had fallen. Some had sprouted. I asked if those were coffee seedlings. He said that they were indeed. I asked if it would be possible to buy coffee seedlings so I could keep one as a house plant. He picked a handful of ripe berries and handed them to me. He said they would grow as long as they didn't as long as they didn't dry out or freeze. I put them in the bag with the bread and cheese. I asked if they required a cold period before they would germinate. I used the word stratification, knowing that that was the technical term among horticulturalists. He smiled and said that being tropical plants, they didn't require stratification. I told him that I had worked at an apple orchard in New Hampshire until just a few weeks ago. I see, he said. Are you planning on staying in San Francisco? No, I said. I'm staying at my brother's house for now. He lives here. But after New Year's, I'm going to move in with some friends up in Washington State, I said. That sounds like a good plan. Washington is a beautiful state, he said. We talked for a few minutes. I was starting to recognize that I was taking up a lot of his time, so I thanked him and dismissed myself and continued touring the Conservatory of Flowers. After about an hour, I went back outside and sat down on the grass. There were other people doing that, so I figured it would be okay. I tore a piece of the bread and used my pocket knife to cut off a piece of the Parmesan cheese. The bread was indeed good. The crust was crunchy, and the bread itself was a little bit chewy, with a sour, yeasty aroma. The cheese, sharp and hard, was the perfect complement to the bread. Wholesome, simple. I never would have known to try it had Matthew not suggested it. It must have been around noon when I got up and walked further into the park. There was the main road with cars going by. I crossed the road and followed a trail into a forested area. There was a small hill shaded by aromatic eucalyptus trees. On the far side of the hill, the trail wound through a grove of tree ferns from New Zealand. It seemed like rain had fallen recently in the tree fern grove. That the ground was moist and the air humid and cool. But rain had not fallen. Perhaps an irrigation system had sprayed water in the night. I didn't know. It was quiet in that part of the park, and there were no people around. It was interesting that there could be such a wild spot within the bounds of a big city. It seemed a place of solitude. Then I had a jolt of surprise when I turned around and saw that a police officer on a bicycle had been following me, just keeping enough distance not to be noticed, until I saw him now. Why was he watching me? Anyway, this is a picture of that. This is the tree fern, what do they call that? The New Zealand. Yep, the tree fern dell in Golden Gate Park. That's that. Okay. So. Okay. I turned around and continued my walk. Looking at the New Zealand tree ferns in the tree fern dell. That's what it was called. It was written on a plaque. When I got to the end of that trail, it appeared that the trail led out onto a road, the edge of the park. So I turned around to go back into the park. I wondered if I would see the police officer again. I didn't. I remember Matthew having said that there are sometimes muggings in the park, so I understood the police presence. But somehow it felt like the officer was not watching me to make sure I didn't get mugged. It felt like he was assessing me on the probability that I was a mugger or some other kind of criminal. Anyway, nothing came of it. I walked back toward the Conservatory of Flowers and then followed a trail to the left, deeper into the park. I came upon a wide outdoor music theater with a half shell. It was about the size of a football field and had fountains and heavily pruned trees like I would have expected on the grounds of a European castle. A plaque said it was the Spreckels Temple of Music. Nobody was playing music there that day. Along one side, there was an art museum, the De Young Museum. On the other side was the California Academy of Sciences. I didn't go inside the museums. I just wanted to walk around the outside. I walked further into the park, past a pond, along a road, through forest. There seemed to be more and more people as I walked, and then I could hear music. It was a free outdoor concert, not at the Spreckels Temple of Music, but in a grassy field. They had built a temporary stage of scaffolding in wood. It turned out to be none other than Marty Balin, the former singer and founder of Jefferson Airplane. I loved Jefferson Airplane. The crowd was just a few hundred people, sitting on the grass of a hill that made for a natural amphitheater. I found a place to sit and listened to the show. I had not expected anything like this. I had thought that the era of free concerts in Golden Gate Park had ended years before, but here was Marty Balin singing. I didn't know who his bandmates were. I had not kept up on those things, but I enjoyed the show. It was interesting to see the people in the audience as well. There were people with faces painted in fluorescent colors, dancing and whirling to the music. But they were not young like the people I had seen in the documentaries of the hippie days of the Haight-Ashbury. These people were in their 30s and 40s, it looked. They might have been the same people as in those documentaries and just never left. One thing I still remember from that concert was two dogs mating. They were both big dogs. One looked like a Weimaraner. The other was a similar-sized dog, but I didn't know the breed. They had become locked together, with the male's penis stuck somehow inside the female. They were obviously trying to become unstuck, but couldn't. Finally, after much yelping, the two dogs stood butt to butt, facing away from each other, and every time the female would try to move, the male would yelp in pain. I found that to be an unpleasant distraction from the music. The strangest part to me, though, was that nobody else seemed to notice. I assumed that the dogs had owners, but this situation continued for at least 5 minutes, and nobody intervened. I had never seen such a thing before. I didn't know if there was anything people could do to help them. It gave the whole scene an air of barbarism, not the flower power, peace and love atmosphere in the old documentaries, but more of a feeling akin to Road Warrior. I decided to continue my walk. I followed the trail west and came to Spreckels Lake. People were gathered along the shore, holding radio control consoles for model yachts. It was a model boat regatta. There was one family, I remember. The father sat in a folding director's chair, his face tense, focused on his boat. Behind him, what must have been his daughter and wife stood cheering him on. Most of the other competitors were old men, all focused on the race. The boats skimmed gracefully on the water, masts all tilted parallel in the breeze. The wind was perfect, the sun shining. The whole thing had a serious atmosphere. There must have been about 20 boats, each one obviously handmade, perhaps replicas of real boats, maybe World Cup winners from decades before. Okay, here's the painting of that. This is the radio-controlled boat regatta on Spreckles Lake. You can see the people with their remote control things. Okay, I could see the wooden decks and the polished brightwork. They were beautiful. I stayed and watched for a while. After that, I continued toward the sea. I began to smell the salt air of the ocean as I walked, the park becoming more wooded toward the west end. There was an enclosure with several bison. The bison paddock, the sign said. After that, I followed a narrow trail into a wooded area. A plaque said that the trees were Monterey cypress, and just like at Big Sur, their upper branches, exposed to the ocean winds, all pointed inland, again warning me to go back. Matthew and I talked about that later. He used the term wind-pruned to describe that. Wind-pruned. I like that term. Matthew had a way of explaining things to me as if he assumed that I was familiar with the terminology he used. I suppose wind-pruned is self-explanatory, but I would never have thought to call it that had I not heard it from him or from somebody else. I had no watch and could only guess the time. I figured that there was about an hour of sunlight left. I didn't know how far it was to the ocean. I followed a path into the cypress forest, not a path maintained by the park, just a footpath in the woods. These trees were bigger and more robust than the ones clinging to the rocks at Big Sur. At one point, the branches interlocked overhead to form a tight canopy under which sunlight could not penetrate. Underfoot, the ground was spongy with matted cypress needles, with no other vegetation able to survive the darkness. The trunks of the trees, gnarled and branchless, stood crookedly like drunken tent poles. The path through here was not on the map. I had noticed that the further west I got in the park, the more dwellings of homeless people I saw. But I didn't see any people. I don't know where the people would go during the day. I suppose that they would return by night. Deep inside the cypress forest, there was almost a village of such dwellings, each one individual. Some had frames of cargo pallets with cardboard or plastic sheet roofing. Others were lean-to shelters made of sticks, covered with leafy branches, the kinds of things I made in the forest behind our house when I was a boy. Okay, so this is a picture of the drawing of the homeless guy, some homeless person's dwelling in western part of Golden Gate Park, where the cedars are, the Monterey cypress are there. And look at those flowers. I'll explain those. Okay. Sorry. But I didn't see any people. I don't know where the people... Okay. I came upon one hut with its own little entranceway off the trail. A frame of branches covered with a blue plastic tarp, a little opening at one end like a wigwam. Nobody was home. I did not venture close. I did not want to be accused of trespassing. I stood on the trail at the point where the entranceway branched off, and I considered the flowers. Yes, there were flowers. They were not growing there. The cypress needles had been cleared, and the dark soil underneath cultivated as if for a garden. The occupant must have picked the flowers somewhere and stuck them by their stems into the soil, all in straight lines leading to the entrance of their home. Some of them were peonies. The others I did not recognize. But I thought about that for some time. Who would do that? Whoever it was obviously wanted to bring some beauty to their surroundings. They had dug up the ground, preparing it like a garden, and then stuck the flowers into the tilled soil, plucked flowers under a cypress canopy. "What are you looking at, Stephen Stroh?" I asked myself. I remember I really did say that out loud. I was not saying it in the retrospective sense. It was an earnest question, a question to which I did not have an answer. But the sun was getting low, and I wanted to get to the beach before dark. From there, I could take a bus back to Matthew's neighborhood. I followed the path through the cypress forest and abruptly came to a highway. This was the Great Highway, Route 1, what Pigpen sang about in the song. I've been ballin' that shiny black steel jackhammer, been chipping up rocks for the Great Highway. Easy Wind was the song. I made my way down to the road. I was back in civilization again. I got a bus along Fulton Street, heading back into the city. I watched as the streets went by, watching the house numbers, counting down toward 2400. 2400 Fulton. There it was, the Jefferson Airplane House. Still there, pillars and all, just like I had seen in pictures. I got off the bus at Masonic. From there, I could walk back to Matthew's place. It was dark now. Matthew had warned me to avoid eye contact with strangers on the street. He had known he had to tell me that. He knew that one of my character traits was that I tended to acknowledge people I met wherever I was. If my eyes met someone else's, I would tip my head, maybe ask how's it going, or offer some other greeting. In New Hampshire, even in Vermont, that had never been a problem. On the contrary, in my experience, failing to acknowledge people might be seen as rude and invite hostility. I knew cities were different. Well, I suppose Matthew was just looking out for me. I thought about the dwellings in the park, especially the one with the flowers stuck in the soil. Somebody lived there. A man? A woman? A couple, maybe? How old are they? Where were they from? How did they come to live in that place? The previous night, several groups of people sitting on the sidewalk along Haight Street had approached Matthew and me, asking for spare change. Matthew told me to avoid eye contact in those situations especially. He said that sometimes people like that can latch on to you and follow you, hoping that you'll give them money just to get rid of them. So best to avoid eye contact, Matthew had said. Who lived in the blue tarp hut with the flowers stuck in the soil out front? I was aware that I knew nothing about the kinds of circumstances that led people to become homeless. I hoped that nothing like that would ever happen to me. The second I said that to myself, I could imagine myself responding with the confident proclamation that I would never become homeless. I would never allow myself to fall that low. As God is my witness, I'll never. That is what society expects. But I didn't respond that way. What I did imagine is that the people who had become homeless had not set out on that course when they were young. Of course, when they were my age, they too had set out in their lives with hopes of building a good life for themselves, but somewhere, somehow, something had gone wrong. Was I taking adequate precautions against such an accident of fate? Or maybe it isn't that they had failed to take precautions. It is impossible to anticipate what situations will fall upon us many years into the future. Of course, there was nothing my mother could have done when she was younger to avoid the fate that befell her. Our fate is in our hands only to the extent that unexpected events don't overtake us. Just like talking about driving skill, I remember once riding in the car with a guy driving who tailgated dangerously. I asked him, please, not to follow so close, and got a swift rebuke. Hey man, don't tell me how to drive. Some people are sensitive to criticism of their driving. even if the criticism is warranted. He kept explaining that he had a system by which he kept track of the traffic ahead of the car in front of him, so he could anticipate when the car in front of him would slow down. It was about 2 weeks later that the guy rear-ended a car in what was actually quite a serious accident, in which, luckily, nobody was killed. Talking to me later, the guy explained that it wasn't really his fault because the car ahead of him had been hit head on by a car that had crossed the center line just at the last second. I remember I didn't say anything snide at the time, but I was thinking of a motto the guy could live by. Picture Douglas Fairbanks as the dashing Zorro, sword in hand. Never expect the unexpected. I don't know what made me think of that, but that's what I was thinking as I made my way up Masonic, past the panhandle of the park, up to Haight, left on Ashbury, up to Matthew's house. Nobody approached or followed me. Okay, that's the end of chapter 10. Okay, so until next time, have a good several weeks.